Excuse me, does your note say, and I quote, also discussed possibility of undiagnosed bipolar disorder given extreme reaction to SSRIs and insomnia, period. Does it say that?
Yes, the way you were saying it made it sound a little bit different before, but that's exactly what I wrote.
I read it directly from your note, right? How did I make it sound different?
I don't know. It sounded different the first time you said it than the second.
So did she have bipolar?
No.
Did you make that decision that night, that day?
I assessed that with her pretty much every time that I saw her, and she never had mania.
She had very, very increased depression, right?
Well, she did. She said
Okay, so
since the Ramadan.
Just answer yes or no.
I'm sorry, I was just trying to check the record.
On January 24, 2023, Lindsay Clancy was at home with her 3 children in Duxbury, Massachusetts. Cora was 5 years old, Dawson was 3, Callan was 8 months old. By the end of the day, none of them would be alive. But there was something about that morning that made the tragedy especially difficult to understand. There were photographs, there were messages, there was a pediatrician appointment, there was snow outside, and there was nothing in those ordinary moments that immediately suggested the children were in danger. That is one of the details that has remained central to the case, because investigators would later learn that Lindsay had been struggling with serious mental health problems for months. She had experienced severe anxiety, insomnia, depression, intrusive thoughts, and suicidal thinking. She had sought treatment from multiple professionals and had briefly been admitted to McLean Hospital. 19 days after leaving that hospital, her 3 children were dead. The prosecution and defense now agree on the essential fact: Lindsay killed them. The dispute is over what was happening inside her mind when she did it. Prosecutors say she deliberately planned the killings and understood what she was doing. Her defense says she was suffering from postpartum psychosis and other severe psychiatric problems and had lost contact with reality. That question would eventually become the center of one of Massachusetts' most closely watched murder trials. But before the courtroom arguments, before the psychiatric experts and the phone records, there was a family living an ordinary life in Duxbury. Lindsay had been a labor and delivery nurse. Patrick was her husband. Together they were raising 3 children. Their youngest, Callan, had been born in 2022. After his birth, Lindsay's condition began to change. She struggled to sleep. Her anxiety became severe. She experienced thoughts that frightened her. And according to evidence later presented in court, she began having thoughts about harming herself and concerns involving her children. She kept seeking help. She saw psychiatrists and other mental health professionals. She was prescribed different medications, sometimes in combination, as doctors attempted to control her symptoms. Her defense would later argue that the changing medications and inadequate treatment contributed to her deterioration. Her doctors gave a different account. One psychiatrist who treated Lindsay testified that she never reported hearing voices or having thoughts of harming her children during their appointments.
Thank you. Now, mental issues like anxiety that was diagnosed, the depression that was diagnosed, and the fact that she indicated yet again that she was close to suicidal ideation, quote, worried about suicidal thoughts, but you indicated that she wasn't suffering from suicidal ideation on that day. Is that fair?
She denied it.
But she told you that she was worried about suicidal ideation and having suicidal thoughts, right?
Well, this was the time she said she was worried that she was close to having suicidal thoughts.
So did you ask her, what does that mean? Does that mean that she's standing at the edge of the stairs and she's thinking about falling down the stairs, or what? What does that mean, close to suicidal ideation?
So I asked about that, and that's when she said she described it further as using the word hopeless.
The defense has argued that the treatment she received failed to identify the seriousness of what was happening. By January 2023, Lindsay had already reached a point where she needed psychiatric hospitalization. She was admitted to McLean Hospital, but the hospitalization was brief. She returned home, and according to the prosecution, she continued functioning in ways that suggested she understood what was happening around her. The defense sees those same months differently. To them, Lindsay's behavior was evidence of a woman desperately trying to find an explanation for a deteriorating mind. Her phone would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence. Investigators found searches involving psychosis, hallucinations, suicide, psychiatric medications, and other subjects related to mental illness. One search, made days before the killings, asked whether a sociopath could be treated. Prosecutors would argue that these searches showed preparation and awareness. The defense would argue they demonstrated how frightened and psychologically disturbed Lindsay had become. The same evidence could be interpreted in completely different ways, and that would become the defining problem for the jury. Then came January 24. That morning, Lindsay took Cora to a pediatrician appointment. Nothing at the appointment alerted medical staff to an immediate crisis. Afterward, Lindsay returned home with the children. At some point, Cora and Dawson played outside in the snow. Lindsay took photographs. She sent photographs to Patrick. The messages were ordinary. There were also communications about food and plans for later that evening. Patrick was at home for part of the day, working in the basement. Then he left to run errands. According to prosecutors, that departure was significant. They argue that Lindsay needed Patrick out of the house before she could carry out what she had planned. The defense rejects that interpretation. For them, the same timeline has to be viewed through the possibility that Lindsay was experiencing a severe psychiatric episode. At approximately 6:11 that evening, Patrick returned. What he found inside and around the house would change the family forever. Lindsay was outside and seriously injured after jumping from a second-story window. Patrick called 911. He was trying to understand what had happened. Then he learned that the children were in the basement. He went downstairs. Cora was there. Dawson was there. Callan was there. All three were unresponsive. Exercise bands were around their necks. Patrick removed them and attempted to revive his children. The emergency call captured his reaction as the reality of what had happened became clear. Cora and Dawson were taken to a hospital. They could not be saved. Callan was flown to Boston Children's Hospital. He remained alive for several days, but his injuries were fatal. He died soon afterward. 3 children were gone, and Lindsay survived. Her suicide attempt left her with catastrophic spinal injuries. She would eventually become paralyzed from the waist down. But the investigation was only beginning, because investigators now had to answer 2 separate questions. What exactly had happened inside the house? And perhaps even more difficult, what had been happening inside Lindsay's mind before it happened? Those questions would eventually take the case from a quiet family home in Duxbury into a courtroom where prosecutors and defense attorneys would tell 2 radically different stories about the same woman. And the first major clue was already sitting inside her phone. The investigation quickly moved beyond the basement. Detectives began reconstructing Lindsay Clancy's life in the weeks before January 24th. Her medical records mattered. Her communications mattered. And increasingly, so did her phone. Investigators recovered searches that showed Lindsay had been trying to understand what was happening to her. There were searches about psychosis, hallucinations, schizophrenia, postpartum depression, suicide, psychiatric medications, and methods of dying. To prosecutors, the searches were evidence of conscious preparation. The defense saw something very different. They argued that Lindsay had been desperately searching for answers because she knew something was wrong and could not understand it. That distinction became crucial, because this was never simply a case about whether Lindsay had mental health problems. The defense was not arguing that she had merely been depressed. They were arguing that she had developed a severe psychiatric disorder that affected her ability to understand reality and control her actions. Their central diagnosis was postpartum psychosis. Postpartum psychosis is rare, but it is considered a psychiatric emergency. Symptoms can include hallucinations, delusions, severe confusion, and loss of contact with reality. The defense argued that Lindsay's condition had progressed into that territory. Prosecutors disagreed. They did not deny that Lindsay had serious psychological problems. Their argument was narrower. Mental illness, they maintained, did not automatically mean that Lindsay was incapable of knowing what she was doing. The evidence from January 24th therefore became extremely important. Earlier that day, Lindsay had taken Cora to a pediatric appointment. She had communicated with Patrick. She had photographed the children playing outside. Then Patrick left. Later, Lindsay attempted suicide. The prosecution argued that the sequence showed planning. The defense argued that the same sequence showed the final collapse of a severely ill woman. The difference between those interpretations would eventually determine whether Lindsay was considered legally responsible for the deaths. There was another part of the evidence that prosecutors focused heavily on: Lindsay's relationship with her husband. Patrick had been aware that his wife was struggling. He had participated in her treatment and had expressed concerns about her condition. After her hospitalization, the family had attempted to establish a safer routine. The prosecution argued that Lindsay nevertheless concealed the seriousness of what she intended to do. The defense argued that Patrick himself had seen how quickly her mental state was deteriorating, and Patrick's actions after returning home became some of the most painful evidence in the case. He had no reason to expect what he was about to find. He entered the house after running errands. Lindsay was outside. She had suffered devastating injuries. Then she told him where the children were. Patrick went downstairs. He found all three. The emergency call became evidence. Jurors would eventually hear Patrick's voice as he tried to understand what had happened and attempted to save his children. The call also established something important about the timeline. The children had been attacked before Patrick returned. There was no question that the killings occurred while he was away. The question was why, and at this point the case began moving toward its most difficult evidence. The medical evidence showed that the children had died from injuries caused by strangulation. Cora and Dawson were found in the den area. Dawson was found in Patrick's home office. Callan was also found in the den area. The exercise bands became a central physical piece of evidence. Investigators recovered them from the children's bodies. There were no questions about how the children died, but the physical evidence could not answer the question prosecutors and defense attorneys were preparing to fight over. Could Lindsay distinguish right from wrong? Could she understand the nature and consequences of what she was doing? Or had a severe psychotic disorder taken away that ability? That question became even more complicated because Lindsay had previously expressed suicidal thoughts. Her phone records showed that suicide had been a recurring subject. Her defense argued that this was important. They said Lindsay's mental illness had been escalating for months, and her searches were evidence of that deterioration. Prosecutors emphasized a different detail. They pointed to searches made close to the killings. They argued that Lindsay was not simply searching for medical information. She was looking at subjects related to death and suicide, while also caring for 3 young children. To prosecutors, the timing mattered. But there was another piece of evidence that would become central: Lindsay's writings. Investigators found personal material describing her feelings about motherhood and her mental state. Some of the writings reflected feelings of inadequacy and disconnection, including concerns involving her youngest child. The defense argued that these writings offered a direct window into her deteriorating condition. They showed a woman who felt overwhelmed and psychologically unwell. Prosecutors could use the same writings to argue that Lindsay knew exactly what was happening in her life. And that was the contradiction running through the entire case. She was clearly suffering. The question was whether that suffering reached the legal threshold for insanity. There was no dispute that Lindsay had received professional psychiatric treatment. There was no dispute that she had been prescribed medication. There was no dispute that she had been hospitalized. There was no dispute that she had experienced suicidal thoughts. The disagreement was over what those facts meant. Her defense argued that the healthcare system had failed to recognize a dangerous psychiatric condition. They questioned whether doctors had properly assessed her symptoms and whether the medications she received may have worsened her condition. Prosecutors argued that Lindsay had access to substantial medical care. She had appointments, she had medication, she had been hospitalized. And yet, according to the prosecution, there was no clear disclosure to her treatment providers that she intended to kill her children. That point mattered because the prosecution was building an argument around awareness. Lindsay knew she was struggling. She sought help. She researched her symptoms. She knew suicide was a subject she needed to confront. But prosecutors argued that knowing she was mentally unwell was not the same as being legally insane. By the time the case reached court, the jury would have to examine all of those details together: the medical records, the searches, the writings, the medications, the hospital admission, the events of January 24, and the final minutes before Patrick came home. The tragedy had already happened. Now the legal system had to determine what kind of tragedy it was. Was this the deliberate killing of 3 children by a mother who understood her actions? Or was it the result of a severe psychiatric illness that had destroyed Lindsay's ability to understand reality? As the trial moved forward, the answer would depend heavily on people who had treated Lindsay before the murders, and their testimony would reveal just how much the people around her knew about the warning signs. That was where the prosecution and defense began pulling the same medical history in opposite directions. The deeper investigators looked into Lindsay Clancy's final months, the more complicated the case became. There were records of treatment, there were messages to caregivers, there were searches on her phone, there were notes describing how she felt, and there were people who had seen her struggling before the children died. One of them was Dr. Jennifer Tufts, a psychiatrist who treated Lindsay. Her testimony became important because it placed Lindsay's suicidal thoughts in the weeks before January 24. Lindsay had told a caregiver that she was experiencing intrusive thoughts she had never experienced before. She described feeling hopeless and expressed concerns about some of the medications she was taking. But there was also a gap. According to testimony, Lindsay had called a suicide hotline twice. Dr. Tufts said she did not know about those calls at the time. That revelation mattered to both sides. The defense argued it showed that Lindsay's condition was more severe than her treatment providers understood. The prosecution could point to the same fact in another way. Lindsay had serious suicidal thoughts. She was seeking help. But the people treating her did not know the full extent of what was happening. The question was whether that failure was caused by a medical system that missed the warning signs, or whether Lindsay herself had concealed the most dangerous parts of her condition. The issue became even more difficult when the jury heard about the medications. By the months before the killings, Lindsay had been prescribed a complicated series of psychiatric medications. The defense argued that the treatment itself had contributed to her deterioration. They described a pattern of medication changes, side effects, and worsening symptoms. The prosecution focused on something different. Lindsay had access to professional treatment. She had communicated with doctors. She had been hospitalized, and she had continued to function in her daily life. That distinction mattered because the legal question was not whether Lindsay had been mentally ill. It was whether her illness had reached the point where she could no longer be held criminally responsible. Then investigators turned to the searches made on her phone. The evidence became increasingly difficult to interpret. Some searches were clearly about mental illness, others involved suicide, and some were more specific. On January 20th, 4 days before the killings, Lindsay's phone was used to search, "Can you treat a sociopath?" according to testimony from a Massachusetts State Police investigator. Other searches included questions about hallucinations, psychosis, and schizophrenia. There were also searches involving methods of dying. Prosecutors argued that the pattern mattered more than any individual search. They said Lindsay was not merely researching postpartum mental illness, she was also researching suicide and methods of death. To the prosecution, that suggested preparation. The defense did not deny the searches. Instead, it argued that the searches showed the severity of Lindsay's psychiatric crisis. A person trying to understand hallucinations or psychosis might search for information because they were frightened by what they were experiencing. A person thinking about suicide might search for information because they were in crisis. The same search history could therefore support completely different conclusions. That was the problem facing the jury. And then came the searches that prosecutors considered even more significant. The phone contained searches concerning how to die and specific methods. The prosecution presented them as evidence that Lindsay had been planning her own death. Her defense argued that suicidal thinking had been documented for months. The searches, they said, were consistent with a woman whose mental health had deteriorated severely. Neither side disputed that Lindsay had been suicidal. The disagreement was about what that meant on January 24. There was also a note on her phone describing feelings of inadequacy as a mother and emotional disconnection from her children. The defense treated the note as evidence of psychological deterioration. The prosecution could argue that the note showed Lindsay understood her own circumstances and was capable of articulating them. Again, the evidence pointed in two directions. By the time the trial entered its third week, jurors had heard testimony about Lindsay's medical treatment, her suicidal thinking, the children's deaths, and the events surrounding her suicide attempt. They had also heard Patrick's 911 call. It was one of the most difficult pieces of evidence in the courtroom. Patrick had returned home. He found Lindsay badly injured. Then he discovered the children. The call captured his immediate reaction. Lindsay became visibly emotional in court as portions of the evidence concerning her children were presented. For the prosecution, the evidence supported a deliberate sequence. They argued that Lindsay waited until Patrick left the house. She then killed the children. Afterward, she attempted to kill herself. The prosecution's theory was that the suicide attempt did not erase the planning that came before it. The defense offered a different sequence. They argued that Lindsay's psychiatric illness had reached a catastrophic level. They pointed to her insomnia, her intrusive thoughts, her suicidal thinking, her treatment history, her medication changes, her hospital admission, and the symptoms she reportedly experienced after returning home. Their argument was that these were not isolated events. They were signs of a deteriorating psychiatric condition. The defense also questioned the care Lindsay received. They argued that medical professionals had been given warning signs but failed to recognize the severity of the illness. That argument extended beyond the courtroom. Lindsay and Patrick later brought legal action against medical providers, accusing them of failing to properly diagnose and treat her condition. But prosecutors challenged the idea that the warning signs had been ignored. They emphasized that Lindsay had been seen by professionals. She had received medication. She had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital. And yet, according to the prosecution, she never clearly told her providers that she intended to kill her children. That distinction became central. A person can be depressed. A person can be suicidal. A person can experience intrusive thoughts and still understand that killing another person is wrong. The defense had to establish something much more severe. They had to persuade the jury that Lindsay's psychiatric condition had impaired her understanding of reality to such an extent that she should not be considered criminally responsible. That is why the testimony about postpartum psychosis mattered so much. It was not simply an explanation for Lindsay's behavior, it was the foundation of the defense. The condition can involve hallucinations, delusions, confusion, and a loss of contact with reality. It is considered a psychiatric emergency and is different from ordinary postpartum depression. The defense argued that Lindsay's symptoms fit that picture. The prosecution argued that the evidence showed something else, and the more evidence the jury heard, the more difficult the central question became. Because Lindsay's behavior before the murders could be viewed as evidence of illness, it could also be viewed as evidence of awareness. Her searches could suggest confusion or preparation. Her communications with her husband could suggest normal daily functioning or concealment. Her treatment history could demonstrate a desperate attempt to get better, or demonstrate that she knew exactly what was happening to her, and her suicide attempt could be seen as the final act of a psychotic episode, or as part of a plan that included killing the children first. There was no dispute about the outcome. 3 children were dead. The disagreement was about the mind behind the actions. And then the trial moved toward perhaps the most important evidence of all, the testimony of people who had known Lindsay before January 24, people who could describe what she had been like before her mental health deteriorated, people who could tell the jury whether the woman who killed her children looked anything like the mother they had known. That testimony would force the courtroom to confront a difficult question. If Lindsay had once appeared completely ordinary, when exactly had something changed? And had anyone recognized how far that change had gone before it was too late? By the 3rd week of Lindsay Clancy's trial, the courtroom was no longer focused only on January 24, 2023. The jury had been taken backward, back through the months of psychiatric treatment, back through the medications, back through Lindsay's increasingly severe symptoms, and back through the final days before 3 children were killed. As of August 14, 2026, there had been 13 days of testimony. The trial was continuing, with no witness testimony scheduled that Friday. The central issue remained the same: mental responsibility. Lindsay has pleaded not guilty and is asserting that she was not criminally responsible because of mental illness. There is no dispute that Cora, Dawson, and Callan died after being strangled with exercise bands. The prosecution says Lindsay deliberately killed them. The defense says severe postpartum psychosis and other psychiatric problems had fundamentally altered her ability to understand reality. The evidence presented during the trial has made both arguments more complicated. One of the most important witnesses was Dr. Jennifer Tufts, the psychiatrist who treated Lindsay before the killings. Tufts testified that Lindsay had been depressed, hopeless, and emotionally withdrawn from Callan, but she also testified that Lindsay did not display signs of psychosis during their appointments. At Lindsay's final appointment, the day before the killings, Tufts said Lindsay denied suicidal and homicidal thoughts. That testimony was significant for prosecutors. If Lindsay had appeared coherent and organized only one day before the murders, they could argue that she understood her circumstances and remained capable of making decisions. But the defense challenged the treatment itself. Attorneys questioned Tufts about her experience with postpartum psychiatric conditions and the fact that much of Lindsay's treatment occurred remotely. They also challenged the medications Lindsay had received and the way her symptoms were handled. The medication history was extensive. Over several months, Lindsay had been prescribed multiple psychiatric medications, including antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication, and antipsychotic medication. The defense argued that the medications produced troubling effects and that the treatment failed to identify the underlying condition. At trial, witnesses described Lindsay reporting that she felt disconnected, confused, or out of it while taking some medications. The prosecution's response was that medication problems did not establish legal insanity. They also emphasized Lindsay's behavior. She continued communicating with people around her. She cared for her children. She attended appointments. She searched for information online. And, prosecutors argued, she eventually carried out a sequence of actions that required awareness. The phone evidence became particularly important. Investigators testified about searches concerning hallucinations, psychosis, and suicide. There were searches about ways to die. One search involved how to treat a sociopath. Another involved how to slit a throat to die. Prosecutors argued that the searches showed Lindsay was considering death and investigating methods. The defense argued that the searches were evidence of a deteriorating mind. That distinction could not be resolved simply by looking at the search terms. The jury had to consider the surrounding circumstances. What was Lindsay experiencing when she made those searches? What did she believe was happening to her? And what did she understand about the consequences of her actions? Those questions were difficult because there was evidence that Lindsay had been desperately trying to get help. She had contacted mental health providers. She had expressed suicidal thoughts. She had been hospitalized. She had returned home. And then, according to prosecutors, she killed her children. The defense says the treatment system failed at precisely the moment when she needed protection. Prosecutors say the evidence instead shows that she had enough awareness to make deliberate choices. The courtroom also heard from people who knew Lindsay before the killings. Some described her as a devoted mother. That testimony did not erase what happened, but it gave jurors a picture of the woman she had been before January 24. It also reinforced one of the defense's central themes. Lindsay's behavior in the months before the killings was not consistent with the person her family and friends had known. The prosecution did not need to prove that Lindsay had always been dangerous. They needed to prove criminal responsibility for what happened on January 24. That meant focusing on the hours surrounding the killings. Patrick had left the house. The children remained with Lindsay. Later, Patrick returned. Lindsay was outside after jumping from a second-story window. The children were downstairs. All three were unresponsive. Patrick called for emergency assistance and attempted to revive them. The evidence from that evening established the physical reality of what had happened, but it still did not answer the question at the heart of the trial. What did Lindsay believe she was doing? That is the question the psychiatric evidence is intended to answer. And it is why the trial has spent so much time examining events that happened months before the children died. A murder trial normally focuses heavily on the act itself. This case is different. The defense wants the jury to understand the progression of Lindsay's mental illness. The prosecution wants the jury to examine the same progression and determine whether, despite her illness, she remained responsible for her decisions. There is also another uncomfortable fact. Lindsay survived. Her attempt to take her own life left her permanently paralyzed from the waist down. She lost her children. Patrick lost all three of his children. And the family that existed before January 24, 2023, no longer exists. The trial cannot change that. It can only determine the legal consequences. If Lindsay is found guilty of first-degree murder, she faces the possibility of life imprisonment without parole. If she is found not criminally responsible because of mental illness, that would not mean an ordinary release into the community. Massachusetts law provides for possible commitment to a secure psychiatric facility, but no verdict had been reached as of August 14, 2026. The trial was still unfolding. And for the people following it, the case had become about more than one terrible afternoon in Duxbury. It had become a question about how a person can be severely mentally ill and still potentially remain legally responsible. It had become a question about what doctors should have recognized. It had become a question about whether warning signs were missed, and it had become a question about how much a search history, a prescription record, a medical appointment, or a person's behavior can actually reveal about what was happening inside their mind. That is why this case has been so difficult to reduce to a single explanation. There was a mother who was experiencing serious psychiatric problems. There were doctors who treated her. There were medications. There were warnings. There were searches about mental illness and suicide. And then there were 3 children who died. Cora was 5, Dawson was 3, Callan was 8 months old. On the morning of January 24th, they played outside in the snow. By evening, they were gone. The courtroom now has to decide what happened in the space between those 2 points. And if the evidence has made one thing clear, it is that the most important question is not whether Lindsay Clancy was mentally ill. The evidence already shows that she was struggling profoundly. The question is whether, on the day she killed her children, that illness had taken away the ability to understand what she was doing. That is what the jury must ultimately decide, and cases like this are worth following carefully because the facts are more complicated than the headline. The purpose of breaking them down is to understand what actually happened, how the evidence developed, and where the law draws the line between mental illness and criminal responsibility. For anyone who has been following the case, the story is not finished yet. As of August 14, 2026, there is still no verdict. The trial continues. But whatever the jury eventually decides, one part of the case can never be changed. Cora, Dawson and Callan will not go home.